The morning they threw Nora Pratt out of the only home she had left, the sky over Montana looked like dirty iron. Not storming, not yet. Just that flat, colorless cold that settles over the high plains in October, like a held breath, like the land itself is waiting to see what happens next. The kind of sky that doesn't offer anything. No warmth, no promise, just wait. She was standing on the porch of her aunt's cabin with one blanket wrapped around her shoulders, a tin cup in her left hand, and nothing on her feet. The boards beneath her were already cold enough to pull the heat right out through her soles. She could feel it, that slow, deliberate stealing. The cold didn't rush. It never rushed out here. It just took and kept taking until there was nothing left to take. The door had slammed behind her 30 seconds ago. It hadn't been a dramatic thing. No screaming, no thrown objects. Just her Aunt Vera standing in the kitchen doorway with that particular look on her face, the one that had been building for 2 years, the one that said Nora had finally used up whatever thin supply of patience the woman had ever possessed. A piece of cornbread had gone missing from the tin on the shelf. That was all. That was the thing that ended it. A piece of cornbread that probably fell behind the stove, or was taken by the dog that slept under the steps, or simply vanished the way small things vanish in houses where people are looking for reasons rather than explanations. Vera had pointed at the door. Nora had walked through it. She hadn't argued because she already knew there was no point. She had lived in enough houses to understand that an argument was only useful when the other person was still deciding. Vera had already decided. The missing cornbread wasn't the reason anyway. It never was. The reasons in places like this were always small and surface and completely beside the point. The real reason was older and quieter and had nothing to do with bread. The real reason was that Nora reminded Vera of her dead sister, and grief, when it goes sour in a person, turns into something else entirely. It turns into the kind of resentment that looks for small justifications because the large ones are too honest to say out loud. She stood on the porch for a moment longer than necessary. Not because she was afraid to leave. She had stopped being afraid of leaving somewhere around her third placement when she was 13 years old and had already learned that the fear of the unknown was just a story you told yourself to avoid admitting how bad the known had become. She stood there because she was doing what she always did in the first seconds of a new situation. She was looking. The land to the west was open, 3 miles of pale grass and rock outcrop before the tree line thickened into something dark and serious. To the north, the ridge, long and low, a shelf of exposed rock above a dry draw that she had looked at her entire life without ever having reason to approach. To the south, the main trail, the one that ran through Harlan's Creek and on toward Bridger, where there were people and stores and men with opinions about what a 16-year-old girl alone in October should do with herself. She did not look south. She stepped off the porch, crossed the yard without hurrying, and walked west. Her name was Nora Pratt, and she was 16 years old, and she had been on her own in one way or another for the past 4 years. Her mother, Eleanor, had died in the spring of 1882. Pneumonia, they said, though Nora had her own thoughts about that, thoughts she kept sealed behind her back teeth and never showed to anyone. Eleanor Pratt had been a quiet woman. Quiet in the way that people become when the world has spent enough years trying to convince them that their voice doesn't matter. She had worked the land. She had kept a small garden. She had raised Nora alone from the time Nora was 3 years old with no help from anyone and no complaint about the absence of it. She had done it in a county that did not particularly value women who didn't need anyone, and she had done it without bitterness, which was its own form of courage. What she had given Nora was not money, not land, not connections. What she had given her was observation. Eleanor Pratt had spent her life watching the women who survived and the women who didn't, and learning the difference between them with the patient attention of someone who understood that the difference was never luck. It was always something smaller and more practical than luck. It was always a decision someone had made before the crisis arrived, a small preparation done quietly in advance of a need that most people didn't see coming until it was too late to do anything about it. She had watched old Hester Crane keep her potato stores under the cabin floor, packed in dry sand, not because Hester had read it in a book, but because one winter her stores had frozen solid above ground, and she had nearly starved, and she had never let it happen again. She had watched Grover Finch stack his split wood in a north-facing ditch lined with flat rocks, angled just slightly toward open ground, So the rain ran off and the air moved through, and the wood came out of winter as dry as it went in. She had watched a widow named Cole who lived half underground in a structure the town folks called a dugout, with something between pity and contempt, go through 3 consecutive bad winters without losing a single animal, without burning a single wet log, without ever running short of heat or food, while the rest of the county scrambled and suffered and occasionally died. Cole had built herself into the earth instead of on top of it, and Eleanor had noticed. She passed all of it to Nora the way she passed everything else, not as lessons, not as lectures, but as observations shared quietly between two people who were paying attention to the same world. They'd be walking past Finch's place, and Eleanor would say something like, "You see the angle on that ditch, the way it drops away from the stack. That's not an accident. That's thinking." And Nora would look, and she would see it, and she would file it away somewhere behind her sternum, where the cold couldn't reach it, in that place where the things worth keeping go, when you understand you may not always have a shelf to put them on. It was not the kind of knowledge that made you impressive at school, or likable at church, or any of the other things that the town quietly demanded of a girl without a father and a mother who kept to herself. It was the kind of knowledge that had no use at all, right up until the moment it was the only thing standing between you and the ground. After Eleanor died, Nora had gone to 5 different homes in 4 years. Her mother's brother first, who returned her after 6 weeks, citing no particular reason beyond a general sense of inconvenience. Then a farming family in Bredger, who needed help with their children and had confused needing help with doing good, 2 things that look identical from a distance and are entirely different up close. Then a woman named Garfield, who had been genuinely kind but had her own troubles that grew heavier than she could carry, and who had sent Nora on with real apology and no good alternative. Then a preacher's household where the preacher's wife had watched Nora the way people watch something they don't trust and can't explain, with a suspicion that had no specific basis and therefore could not be addressed or argued away. And finally, Vera Pratt, 54 years old, her mother's older sister, her last living relation within 100 miles. Vera, who had her dead sister's cheekbones and none of her warmth. Vera, who had taken Nora in the way a person takes in a debt, acknowledging the obligation while resenting every day of it, finding small grievances to justify the resentment, stacking them up the way you stack wood before burning it. 2 years. Nora had lasted 2 years, and now she was walking west barefoot on cold October ground with 1 blanket and a tin cup and $10 sewn into the hem of her petticoat. She didn't find the tuck of paper until the 2nd mile. Her feet had gone from painful to numb, which was in its own way a mercy, and she had stopped to pull the blanket tighter and check the state of her options, and she'd felt the stiffness in the hem that she'd always taken for extra stitching. She stopped walking, worked at the thread with her thumbnail. The way you work at something you've been meaning to examine for a long time and kept putting off. Pulled out a small fold of paper wrapped around a small fold of bills. $10. 5 $2 notes, soft and creased like they'd been folded and unfolded many times before being put away for the last time. And the paper. She had to hold it close to read her mother's handwriting, which had always been small and precise, like Eleanor had understood even then that the spaces where she got to write things down were limited and shouldn't be wasted. County filing fee paid August 1885. Federal Survey Rider attached survey number 1142-MT, land off Miller Ridge. Registered under Eleanor Pratt. Yours recorded both ways. Mama. Nora read it twice. Then she stood very still in the middle of the open prairie with the wind pulling at her blanket and the cold working steadily at her feet, and she held the paper and she thought her mother had bought land, not left money, not left a note saying she was sorry and she loved her. She had bought a piece of ground, filed the paperwork with the county, paid a small additional fee to have it included in the federal survey sweep, and left her daughter the receipt. Eleanor Pratt, who had never had more than $30 in the house at one time in her entire life, had spent those $10 with the precision of someone who had thought about it carefully and decided that this was the most important thing the money could do. In the 1880s, the federal government ran periodic survey sweeps across contested Montana territory. For a small additional fee attached to a county filing, sometimes as little as $2 or $3, a landowner could request inclusion in the next federal sweep. The county recorded the claim, Washington recorded the survey, 2 registrations, 2 sets of books, 2 different offices. Eleanor Pratt had known this. She had observed it the way she observed everything that mattered, and she had acted on it quietly without telling anyone the way she did everything that was important. Nora looked west. Miller Ridge was the long, low rise of land she could see about 2 miles ahead, a rocky shelf above a dry draw exposed on the north and east, but sheltered on the west where a natural outcrop of stone broke the wind. She knew it vaguely the way you know landmarks you've looked at your whole life without ever having reason to approach. She put the paper in her tin cup, held the cup against her chest inside the blanket, and kept walking. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried since she was 14. Crying took something out of you that you needed for other things. She found the spot by mid-afternoon. The draw was drier than she'd hoped and better than she'd feared. A shallow depression in the land, maybe 30 feet long, where the ground dipped away from the base of the rock outcrop and then rose again on the south side, naturally sheltered, naturally draining. The soil was heavy with clay in the upper layer, which meant it would hold a shape if you worked it right. The rock face to the west would block the worst of the weather once it came. A tangle of dead brush along the northern edge could be cleared and used as material or windbreak. The ground sloped slightly toward the east, which meant runoff would carry away from the natural shelter rather than pooling against it. She stood in the middle of it for a long time, turning slowly, looking at it from every angle the way her mother had taught her to look at things. Not seeing what it was, seeing what it could be. She had no lumber. She had no nails. She had $10 she was not going to spend if she could avoid it, a tin cup, a blanket, and a dead woman's knowledge of how the world actually worked when the weather turned serious. She started digging. There was a shed 2 miles back along the eastern trail, and she'd passed it on the way, half collapsed, its roof caved under 3 seasons of snow and neglect belonging to nobody she could identify. It contained what appeared to be a broken plow, 3 rusted hand tools of uncertain purpose, and an old pickaxe with a cracked handle that had been left because the handle was cracked and taken because the head was still good, and a cracked handle was better than no pickaxe at all. She went back for it, picked up the pickaxe, assessed the crack halfway up the shaft, not through the center grain, which meant it would hold for careful work if she didn't lever with it and walk back to the draw. She dug for the rest of that first day until she couldn't see, then wrapped herself in her blanket against the lee side of the rock and lay still with her teeth clicking together like something mechanical and her hands too stiff to fully close. The ground was cold, not frozen not yet, but cold in the deep way that meant frozen was coming. She slept in pieces, waking every hour or so to some sound or internal alarm, then going under again into a sleep that was more like managed unconsciousness than actual rest. On the second day, she dug some more. She wasn't digging a cellar. She wasn't digging a room or a shelter or any of the things a person might instinctively reach for when faced with a winter and no walls. She was digging a trench long and low, sloping slightly from the rock end toward the south with a narrow drainage channel at the base angled toward open ground. The slope was important. Her mother had explained it once while they watched Grover Finch ruin a cord of wood in a flat-bottomed pit. Water doesn't care about depth. Water cares about angle. Give it somewhere to go and it'll go. Don't give it somewhere to go and it'll sit right there with everything you were counting on, turning it soft and useless and eventually black. The trench was not elegant. It was not the kind of thing anyone would look at and admire or even immediately understand. It was roughly 5 feet wide and 4 feet deep and about 14 feet long, widening slightly at the sheltered end where the rock face offered natural bracing. She sloped the floor 3 degrees. She measured it by eye, the way her mother had taught her to use the horizon as a reference, the way you could feel a true level in your body if you paid enough attention to it for long enough. 3 degrees was not instinct. 3 degrees was something she had worked out by watching Finch's ditch one afternoon when she was 11, counting the number of degrees between the top of the stack and the edge where the channel ended and understanding that the number mattered. On the third day, she walked into Harlan's Creek. She needed materials. The $10 in her cup was something she intended to protect as long as she possibly could not, because she thought of it as money equally, but because she thought of it as her mother's last decision, and her mother's last decisions had a way of being correct. But she needed planks, and she needed oilcloth, and she had 40 cents saved in pieces over 2 years, from small tasks done for neighbors, grass cutting, wood splitting, watching children for an afternoon, and 40 cents was something to work with if she was careful about it. She found a widow on the eastern edge of town, selling off her late husband's tools and lumber. The woman's name was Birch, and she had the look of someone in the process of converting her life into cash as efficiently as possible and didn't have energy left over for other people's business. She didn't ask Nora any questions, which Nora appreciated more than she would have appreciated kindness. She spent 40 cents on 6 warped planks, a length of oilcloth, and a rusted tin plate. She carried them herself, 2 trips because she could only carry so much at once, and the walk was 3 miles each way, and her feet had developed a hard redness on the bottom that was not yet callous but was working toward it with the dedication of skin that has been given no other option. On the 4th day she covered the trench. She split 2 of the planks into narrower sections and laid them across the top as joists spaced a foot apart. Over the joists she laid the remaining boards, and over the boards she packed clay, thick wet clay she dug from the north side of the draw where the ground stayed damp longer, working it in by hand, pressing it flat, smoothing the seams with her palm until each section fit against the next without gap. Then a layer of dead grass cut with the edge of her tin plate laid in overlapping rows like rough thatch. Then another layer of clay over that packed tighter than the first. She made a vent hole at the far end, angled upward at about 45 degrees, no bigger than her fist, covered with a loose, flat stone she could move. She hung the oilcloth over the entrance, not a door, just a curtain, but heavy enough to keep the wind from pushing through and light enough to pass through quickly without noise. Inside, she laid the salvaged boards along the walls as rough shelving, one side for firewood, one side for kindling and bark, and the smaller material that caught easily. She dug a small drainage channel along the base of the north wall, barely an inch deep, running toward a gap at the near end where it could trickle out into the draw and away. She stomped the floor flat with her heels, working methodically from back to front until it stopped giving under pressure. Then she stood inside her trench in the dark with the oilcloth curtain behind her and the clay ceiling 3 inches above her head, and she breathed. It smelled like cold earth and pine and something mineral she couldn't name. It was dark enough that she could only feel the wall rather than see them. She ran her hand along the clay ceiling. Solid. She pressed her palm flat against the north wall. Packed tight. She crouched and pressed her fingers against the drainage channel at the base, angled correctly, running toward the exit. She looked at the vent hole above where the fire ring would be small enough to hold heat placed correctly to draw. Everything her mother had ever shown her filed away and kept and carried through 5 houses in 4 years, in one October morning with no shoes and a door slamming at her back, had led to this exact moment. This dark, cold, low-crude, perfectly dry space in the earth. She wasn't safe. She hadn't won anything. She was a 16-year-old girl with no shoes and 35 cents left in a tin cup and a winter coming that the sky had been promising for weeks, with the flat gray certainty of a debt collector who knows they will collect. But she had this, and this was dry. She spent the next 3 days gathering. The trail that ran west from Harlan's Creek to the Bridger Road passed about a mile north of Miller Ridge. Wagons used it regularly enough that there was always debris along the shoulders, splintered boards fallen from loads, broken axles abandoned in the scrub split wood that had bounced off a cart and been left behind because no one was going back 3 steps for a single piece of firewood. Nora worked the trail like a field, covering it in long, patient sweeps, picking up every fragment worth carrying, assessing each piece for moisture and density, with the quick attention of someone who had thought about what made wood burn well. She found a half-burned wood pile at the edge of a logging camp that had been abandoned for the winter. The near side had caught fire at some point, and the far side hadn't, and the far side was 3 feet of split hardwood stacked under a collapsed lean-to that had kept most of the weather off. Not dry, not exactly, but drier than anything she was going to find in the open. She loaded her arms until her muscles shook, walked to the trench, unloaded carefully wetter pieces to the upper shelf near the vent, driest pieces at the far end away from any moisture risk, walked back and loaded again. She did this until the light went, and then she lay down and let her body process what it had done to itself over the previous 12 hours. The stack inside the trench grew. 1 row, then 2. She arranged the pieces with the attention of someone laying a plan, rather than simply stacking fuel, each piece chosen for its position, the wettest wood upwind of the vent, where air movement could work on it, the driest wood quarantined at the back, where nothing could touch it until she needed it most. She still had no fire. She had the trench and she had the wood, and she had a hunger that had moved past pain into something more like a permanent condition of the body, a weather pattern rather than an emergency. She'd found a creek a half-mile east and drank from it morning and night. She'd eaten what the land offered in October, rose hips from a bush along the rock face, dry and seedy, but present. A handful of pine nuts pried from a cone with her thumbnail. One at a time over the course of an afternoon, 3 small potatoes, taken from the edge of a farm field she'd passed, which she ate raw because raw was better than nothing, and she had no fire to do otherwise with them. She needed fire. She found the dead man on the 5th morning. He was lying face down in a hollow about a quarter-mile north of the ridge, in a low spot where a creek had once run and now just held cold air, and the particular stillness of ground that had not been walked on in some time. He'd been there long enough that his clothes had stiffened to the shape of his body, but not so long that anything else had started. He was wearing the coat and boots of a working man and carrying the tools of a surveyor, a brass instrument in a leather case, a folding ruler, a leather satchel worn soft at the straps from years of daily use. Nora stood over him for a moment without moving. She had seen dead people before, 3 counting this one. Death at 16 in Montana in the 1880s was not an abstraction. She knew what it looked like, and she knew what it required of the living in its immediate vicinity, which was primarily the willingness to be practical when everything in you wanted to be something else. Then she crouched and went through the satchel methodically, the way she did everything without hurry, without sentiment, with the particular quality of attention that comes from understanding that what you overlook in a moment like this can kill you just as effectively as anything more dramatic. Hard biscuits, 4 of them, dense and cracked from the cold. She put them in her blanket without stopping to examine them further. A tin box. She opened it. Matches not full, maybe half the box, the heads still good and dry inside the sealed tin. She held the box in both hands for a moment and felt something shift in her chest that she didn't have a precise word for. Not gratitude exactly, something more physical than gratitude. The recognition of the specific thing that stands between you and a particular kind of ending. And at the bottom of the satchel, rolled tight and tied with a piece of waxed string, a map. She untied it and spread it flat across her knee, holding the edges against the wind with her forearms. It was detailed work, the kind of map that took patience and precision and weeks in the field measuring and remeasuring until the numbers were right. It showed the land around Miller Ridge in a grid of careful measurements, with small annotations in a handwriting she didn't recognize, and topographical notations she had to study for a moment before she could read them. In the upper right corner, a stamp dark and square, U.S. Land Survey Office, Montana Territory. Survey number 1142-MT, filed with Federal Registry. She traced the grid with her finger until she found the section that matched the draw. And there in the surveyor's careful notation was a name and a date and a registration number. Eleanor Pratt, filed August 14, 1885. County refers to M-8821. Federal writer confirmed. Nora was still for a long time. The tuck of paper in her tin cup, the county filing fee, the federal survey rider attached, survey number 1142-MT. And here in the dead man's satchel, the map that the Federal Survey had produced, the physical record of the measurement that made the registration real. This was the man her mother had arranged to come. This was the work her mother's last $10 had set in motion. He had done his job. He had measured the land and recorded the notation and died somewhere in the process of finishing or delivering his work. And the map he'd carried had waited in his frozen satchel for the person it was meant to reach. The land wasn't just registered at the county level, it was registered with the federal government, in an office in Helena, in a set of books that had nothing to do with the Harlan's Creek County building or the men who ran it. The land was hers. Not hers if someone decided to honor a dead woman's wishes. Not hers when she came of age and could prove it. Hers. Recorded and measured and filed in 2 places, one of which no local authority could touch, without starting a process that would take years and require cause that didn't exist. Her mother had known she was dying, had known Nora would be alone, had spent her last $10 not on food or medicine or any of the immediate things that $10 might have addressed, but on a piece of ground registered in 2 sets of books, so that when the world came for her daughter and her mother had understood that the world would come, because her mother had paid attention her entire life to exactly this kind of thing. Her daughter would have something the world couldn't easily reach. Nora rolled the map carefully and tucked it inside the tin cup against the paper from her mother and wrapped both in the oilcloth from her blanket. Then she dug a grave for the surveyor at the base of the rock, shallow but covered and marked with a flat stone she set upright at the head. She didn't say anything over it. She had never been comfortable with the kind of words people said at graves. They always seemed to be more for the living than the dead, and the dead in her experience had moved beyond needing the performance. She went back to the trench. She struck a match. She held it to a handful of dry bark shavings she'd kept in her coat pocket since the day before. The fire caught. She was sitting by a small ring of stones she'd built at the inner entrance, close enough to the vent hole to draw the smoke properly far enough from the walls to be safe when she heard footsteps on the draw above her, not many. One person moving with the care of someone watching where they put their feet on uncertain ground. She stayed still the way her mother had said to stay when you heard something you didn't recognize. Stillness is information. Moving gives you away before you know what you're giving yourself away to. The footsteps stopped. A quiet exhalation, the kind a man makes when he's looked at something and is working out what he thinks about it. Then silence. Then a voice low and unhurried coming from somewhere above and to the left of the entrance. Slope's right. Most men don't get the slope right. Nora looked up through the gap in the oilcloth. There was a man standing on the edge of the draw looking down at the covered trench. Somewhere past 50 with the particular weathered quality of someone who had spent most of their life working outside and had stopped being bothered by weather around the same time they stopped being bothered by most other things. He was carrying a load of split wood on a carrier across his back, and he was looking at her trench with the expression of a man who has seen the thing he was looking for in an unexpected place. He wasn't hostile. He wasn't calculating. He was just looking with the genuine attention of a craftsman examining another person's work. He looked at her once, a brief, level look that took in the blanket and the bare feet and the tin cup and the small fire without appearing to make any judgment about any of it, the way a person looks at a fact rather than a problem. And then he looked back at the trench. Drainage is running the right direction, he said. Clay on the roof will hold through the first heavy snow. After that, you'll want to check the east seam. Clay contracts in the deep cold, and the seam is where it shows first. He shifted the weight of the carrier on his back. Most men, he said, don't get the slope right. Then he walked on unhurried between the rocks and into the trees, and the sound of him faded until there was only the wind and the small sound of the fire doing what fire does when the wood is dry. He was Amos Keld. She didn't know that yet, but she would. Nora sat with his words for a while. The way you sit with the first decent thing that has happened to you in a long time, carefully not quite trusting it, but not throwing it away either, examining it from different angles to see if it holds up. The east seam. She looked at it from inside the trench, traced it with her finger in the low firelight. She could feel where the clay had been packed in two separate sessions, the slight irregularity where one layer met the next. She would repack it in the morning. She went back to work. In the town of Harlan's Creek, 2 miles east, a man was sitting in a back room with a closed door. His name was Judge Silas Cord. He was 58 years old, and he had the kind of face that looked reasonable in good light, square jaw, patient eyes, the careful expression of a man who had learned early that patience was more effective than force when you had the law on your side and no particular urgency to your timeline. He had been judge of the Harlan's Creek Territorial Court for 11 years, long enough that the distinction between his personal interests in the court's authority had become in his own mind somewhat academic. Across from him sat a younger man named Pruitt, who served as his clerk and handled the tasks the judge preferred not to associate himself with publicly. "The girl's out," Pruitt said. "Vera Pratt put her out this morning." Cord nodded slowly. He had been waiting for this news the way you wait for a letter you know is coming. "And the land filing. County level only as far as I can determine." Cord looked at his folded hands. A woman like Eleanor Pratt didn't have the means for a federal survey. She filed a county claim, paid the county clerk, and died before she could do anything more with it. He said it with the certainty of a man who had decided the answer before asking the question, which is a different thing from knowing it. Pruitt was quiet for a moment. "The girl is 16. I know how old she is. If she makes it to the land office." "She is 16 years old," Cord said. And she is walking in October with no shoes and no food and no family and nowhere to go. She will not make it to the land office. He paused, looking at nothing in particular. She will not make it to November. He said it without pleasure. That was the particular quality of Silas Cord. He wasn't cruel in the way that enjoys itself. He was cruel in the way of a man doing arithmetic. The girl was a variable. The land was the answer. The arithmetic was straightforward, and straightforward arithmetic didn't require anything as inefficient as pleasure. Under Montana territorial law, he said, an unoccupied or unimproved parcel with an uncontested county filing can be acquired by petition after 90 days of abandonment. We wait 90 days, then we file. Pruitt closed his notebook and left. Outside, the iron sky pressed down on the plains. 2 miles west, in a low draw beneath a clay-covered trench that smelled like cold earth and pine, a 16-year-old girl fed another piece of dry wood onto her fire and watched the flame take it clean and steady. She didn't know about the 90 days. She didn't know about Silas Cord. She didn't know yet about all the things that were already in motion, moving toward her with the quiet patience of a Montana winter that had decided it wasn't going to hurry. She only knew what she could see and what she could touch and what she had built with her own hands from nothing. And what she had built was dry, and what was dry would burn, and what burned was hers. The first real snow came on a Tuesday. Nora knew it was Tuesday because she had been marking days on the inside wall of the trench with a nail she'd found in the dirt near the abandoned woodpile, one scratch per morning, grouped in sevens, the way her mother had kept time when they were too far from town to need a calendar for anything practical. She had been on Miller Ridge for 19 days when the sky finally stopped threatening and started delivering. She lay still inside the trench and listened to it come. Snow doesn't announce itself the way rain does. Rain arrives with sound on the roof, on the leaves, on the hard ground outside a door. Snow arrives with silence, a deepening of it, a quality of hush that has weight, like the world is being slowly packed in something thick and cold and entirely indifferent to what it covers. She heard the wind drop first, which was the warning. Then nothing. Then after a while, the faint compression of the air itself, the way the atmosphere changes when moisture is falling in a different state. She pulled the oilcloth curtain aside and looked out. White, already white and still falling, and the sky above it, the same colorless gray it had been for 3 weeks, except now it was delivering on what it had always promised. The rock face to the west was already softened. The trail to the north had disappeared. The draw was filling from its edges, the grass flattening under the accumulation. She let the curtain drop and sat back. Her wood was stacked 3 rows deep on the dry side of the trench. The kindling shelf was full. She had been stockpiling bark and shavings and the small dry material that catches quickly for 2 weeks, treating the kindling shelf as something separate from the firewood. And equally important, because a trench full of hardwood is useless if you can't get a flame started when the temperature is below zero and your hands aren't working properly. The drainage channel along the base of the north wall had been cleared that morning. The vent hole was angled correctly. She had adjusted it twice in the past week based on where the smoke went, working backward from the evidence until the draw was clean and the flame burned without wavering. The east seam of the clay roof had been repacked the day after Amos Keld's visit, and once more a week after that. She was as ready as she was going to be. She struck a match, touched it to the bark shavings in the fire ring, and watched the flame take hold with the clean, immediate authority of dry wood properly prepared. Outside, the snow kept falling. By the end of the first week of November, the storm had done what Montana storms do. When they mean it, it had stopped being a single event and become a condition, a state of the world rather than a departure from it. The temperature dropped below zero and stayed there with the permanence of something that has decided to move in. The snow didn't melt between falls. It accumulated, compacted under its own weight, developed a crust, and then received more on top of the crust, and the prairie outside the draw became something that looked peaceful from a distance and was not. Nora knew what was happening in town before she went to see it, because she understood the arithmetic of preparation in its absence. And she understood it the way you understand something you've watched your whole life from close enough to see the details. She went into Harlan's Creek once in the second week of November for salt and to trade a piece of deer hide she'd found frozen under a fallen tree near the creek bed, stiff and cold but intact, useful to someone who could work it. She walked in from the west with her blanket pulled over her shoulders and her feet wrapped in doubled strips of burlap she'd cut from a sack abandoned near the trail, tied tight enough to stay on, but not so tight they stopped the blood. The town looked like a place that was deciding whether to give up. The main street was churned to a gray slurry of ice and mud and horse traffic already refreezing at the edges into uneven ridges that turned each step into a small negotiation. Three chimneys were putting out the wrong kind of smoke. Thick, dark, reluctant, the smoke of wet wood fighting itself to burn, filling rooms with heat that cost twice what it should and left everything smelling of something gone wrong. She passed a man stacking green-cut timber against the side of his cabin, freshly felled bark, still bright, and she recognized immediately what he had done and what it would cost him. Green wood in cold storage was just wet wood with ambitions. By January, those ambitions would be fully defeated, and he would have a stack of fuel that wouldn't catch without a great deal of effort and wouldn't burn without a great deal of smoke. She bought her salt, traded the hide for a length of rope and 3 dried strips of venison, and walked back west without talking to anyone more than necessary. She didn't feel superior. She felt something more practical than that, a cold, clear awareness of what was coming and what it would cost the people who hadn't prepared for it. It wasn't a comfortable thing to know. It was just true. The Harper cabin fire happened on a Thursday night in the 3rd week of November. Nora didn't see it. She heard about it 4 days later from Amos Keld, who came to the draw carrying a load of salvaged lumber, and the expression of a man who has seen something that confirmed exactly what he feared and found no satisfaction in being right. 3 people. The Harper family had been burning a wood stack that had sat outside under a poorly constructed lean-to through 2 weeks of snow and freezing rain. The wood had been wet through the core and frozen on the outside, and they had packed the stove too full trying to extract enough heat from it. The stovepipe had clogged with creosote that wet wood deposits at twice the rate of dry. The fire had found its way into the wall through a gap no one had noticed because the wall had been built in summer, when gaps in walls didn't matter the same way. 3 people in one night. Amos set down his lumber at the edge of the draw and sat on the flat rock and told her this without particular emotion, because he was a man who had learned that emotion was a separate process from information, and right now information was what was needed. 2 more cabins burning wet wood, he said. Maybe 3. You can tell by the color and the density of the smoke. Dry wood burns pale. Wet wood burns dark. Nora nodded. She was standing at the entrance to the trench with the posture she always had when she was listening carefully, still, weight slightly forward, eyes not quite on the speaker. Your east seam, he said. Repacked it twice. He nodded once, the nod of a man hearing what he needed to hear. He looked at the covered trench, the smooth expanse of clay and dead grass that from 10 feet away looked like nothing more than a slight irregularity in the ground, a natural bump in terrain that would not draw a second look from anyone who didn't already know what they were looking at. You're going to need more bracing on the north side before the real weight comes. What you have will hold the first load. It won't hold the second. I know, Nora said. The load is going to be heavier than you think. It always is. I know. He looked at her, then directly for the first time since he'd sat down. I built something like this once, he said. Winter of 1839. I was 10 years old. A camp in Wyoming storm came in faster than expected, and the people who were supposed to come back for me didn't. He paused. His voice carried the flatness of something told in summary rather than full detail, not avoiding it, just keeping only what mattered. A woman showed me the basics. Slope, vent, clay over dirt. Then the weather broke and she walked on. He looked at the trench. I built my version that winter. Roof caved in on the 2nd week. 2 people I was sheltering were inside. A pause. I hadn't braced the north side properly. He reached back into the carrier and set 3 salvaged posts on the ground beside the draw. Old growth, dense and dry, about 4 feet long, each the kind of wood that had been standing long enough to be something more than just timber. Set them in clay, not loose dirt, 2 feet down. Clay holds the base when the weight shifts and the ground moves with the cold. He stood and settled the carrier back on his shoulders. Amos Keld, he said without turning around. My boy Cobb knows where this draw is. I'll send him when there's more to bring. He went between the trees. Nora looked at the 3 posts on the ground. She picked up the pickaxe and started digging the holes for them, working carefully at the positions where the north wall needed the most support, measuring depth by feel and by the resistance of the clay at 2 feet down, the way you learn to measure things when you've been paying attention to the right teacher. Cobb Keld arrived 3 days later. He was 17 and built with the particular solidity of someone who had been doing physical work since he was old enough to be useful and had never stopped. Not rude, but operating at a frequency that suggested words were a tool he used only when silence had definitively failed to communicate what needed communicating. He arrived with a bundle of salvaged lumber on his back and a look on his face that said he had been given instructions and intended to follow them. And that was the extent of the transaction as far as he was concerned. He put the lumber down, looked at the trench for a moment with the same evaluating attention his father used, understood the logic of what had been built without being told, and started working. They expanded the north branch that day, a side passage about 8 feet long, wide enough to stack wood 2 rows deep on each side, with its own drainage channel feeding back to the main one. Cobb worked without needing direction. He looked at what existed and continued its logic, which was Nora thought a kind of intelligence that didn't announce itself, but showed up consistently in the work. He left before dark. He came back twice more that week. Each time he brought something useful, more salvaged lumber, a bundle of dried moss stripped from a fallen log that would serve as insulation in the wall gaps, a handful of iron spikes that could anchor the bracing posts more securely than clay alone. They didn't talk much, and when they did, it was about the work. But what they did together held, and in the state of the world outside the draw held, was the only measure that mattered. By the end of November, the trench had become something more than a wood store. Nora had added a second shelf along the south wall, kindling on one end, accumulated supplies on the other. The tin with the remaining matches. A folded piece of wool she'd traded a day's labor for. A clay pot she'd made herself from the deposit along the creek bed, formed by hand and dried slowly near the fire vent over 4 days until it was hard enough to trust. Inside the pot, sealed with a plug of hardened pine resin, she'd bled from a wound in the bark of a nearby tree, her mother's note. The map, both held against everything in the most protected place she could make. The fire vent now had a second section, a horizontal run of about 6 feet through the clay, before it angled upwards so the smoke traveled away from the entrance and emerged from the ground nearly 20 feet to the east, hidden behind a stand of brush she'd reinforced with deadfall positioned to look natural. From outside in daylight, you couldn't find it unless you knew exactly where to look. At night in the deep cold, there was a faint shimmer of warm air rising, but you had to be looking for it specifically, and you had to know what the shimmer of a buried vent looked like against dark ground. The trench was warm, not warm the way a well-built cabin is warm, not the warmth of refinement or comfort or the luxury of space. It was the warmth of survival, which has a specific and practical temperature, enough to keep the body doing what bodies need to do, enough to keep the hands working and the mind clear and the fire manageable. She woke in the mornings without the bone-deep ache that had been her constant companion through 5 houses and 4 years of inadequate heating. Her hands worked properly when she needed them. That was the definition of warm enough, and she had it. She was still thin, she was still hungry more days than not, but she was warm, and the wood that kept her warm was dry, and it burned clean, and it lit on the first match, and that in the winter of 1886 was something most of the men in Harlan's Creek with their cabins and their families and their wood stacked outside under whatever cover they'd managed to rig before the first snow could not say. The men came on a Wednesday afternoon in late November. She heard them before she saw them, 5 men walking through frozen brush in heavy boots, making no particular effort at quiet, because 5 men together rarely do. She was inside the trench, feeding the afternoon fire, and she was outside and standing on the ridge above the entrance before they cleared the tree line. She recognized 2 of the Greaves brothers who ran the feed supply on the south end of Harlan's Creek and who had between them a long-standing belief that their combined size settled most questions before they needed to be asked. The other 3 were men she knew by sight, 30s and 40s, the particular look of people who had spent 2 uncomfortable weeks running out of good options and had decided that someone else's solution ought to be available to them. They stopped when they saw her. She was standing on the icy ledge above the trench entrance, with her feet planted on the frozen rock, holding her hatchet in her right hand at about hip height, not raised, not threatening. Present the way a fence post is present, not aggressive, just definitively there, establishing what is on which side. She let them stand. Let them look at her and at the ridge and at the hatchet and at each other, and let them work out whatever they were going to work out. Then she said clearly and without heat, "You want warmth, you earn it." The taller Greaves brother opened his mouth. "You come in, you bring something," she continued, before he could shape whatever he'd intended. "Wood, bark, food, anything worth having. You follow my rules while you're inside. You leave before first light." She looked at each of them in turn the way her mother had told her to look at a dog you weren't sure about, steady, not challenging, simply establishing that there was no uncertainty on your side. You touch anything without asking, you go back out in the cold. The Greaves brother looked at her hands, at the hatchet, at the steadiness of both. "You're 16 years old," he said. "The way a man says a fact, he's offering to see what you'll do with it." "I know how old I am," Nora said. "I also know what you'll be in the morning if you walk back to town in the dark at 10 below." She held his look, didn't blink, didn't shift her weight. "Your choice, Reese." He stood there for another moment. Then he looked at the men beside him. Then he looked back at her, and something in his face rearranged itself, not softened, but recalculated. The recognition that this particular situation was not going to respond to the approach he normally used because the person in front of him had nothing left to be threatened with, and knew it. "I got half a sack of oats on the sled," he said. "Leave it at the entrance. Then come in one at a time." They did. She let them sleep in the North Branch passage in shifts, feeding them from her fire, but not from her woodstock. They could feed that themselves from what they'd brought and from gatherings she directed in the morning. They slept without talking much. They left before dawn as instructed. They left the oats. Without any discussion, they also left 2 pieces of deer hide and a flintstone one of them apparently carried as a matter of habit. Nora counted the oats and put the hide on the shelf and did not categorize what had happened as kindness or transaction. It was both. In a Montana winter, both was the only form that worked. December came like a door closing. The temperature dropped past the point where it was useful to describe it in numbers and became instead a condition of the world, the kind of cold that cracks split wood and splits stone and turns the interior of your nose to ice within 2 steps of being outside. The trail between Harlan's Creek and the Bridger Road drifted closed 3 times in 3 weeks. A horse team was found frozen upright in the yard behind the tavern, still in harness, eyes open. The school closed. The ink in the postmaster's pen froze solid in his hand while he was mid-sentence. Children's fingers turned the color of old wax if they touched a metal latch too long. The saloon became the town's collective survival strategy. Men crowding in with whatever they had left to burn, filling the room with greenwood smoke that sat in the lungs like something hostile and produced half the heat it should while consuming twice the fuel. In the draw west of town, Nora's trench held. The clay roof had not sagged. The drainage channel had not blocked, and the east seam, repacked 3 times now, showed no moisture in any of the 3 daily checks she ran on it. The braced north wall, set with Amos's posts and packed clay 2 feet down, had not shifted under 4 feet of accumulated snow. The fire vent drew clean and released nothing visible from outside during the day. 2 logs a night, one in the evening when she built the fire up for cooking and warmth, one banked under ash at midnight to carry heat slowly through to morning. She had calculated her remaining supply against the likely length of the winter, and the calculation required discipline. And she had discipline because the alternative to discipline was death, and she had decided some time ago that she was not prepared to accept that outcome. She was thin. She was hungry more days than she wasn't. The oats helped. The venison she traded for in town helped. The squirrels she found frozen near the creek, which were meat even if they weren't much of it, helped. She was thin in the way of someone who has made peace with it, not as a condition to fix, but as the current state of things, something to work within. She was also, for the first time in 4 years, not afraid. Not because the danger had gone. The danger was everywhere in the depleting supplies and the men who knew she existed in the cold itself, which did not care about preparation or ingenuity or how carefully you'd thought things through. The danger was constant and present, and she did not pretend otherwise for a single day. But fear, she had learned, was a different thing from danger. Fear was what happened when you didn't know what to do. She knew what to do. She had a trench in wood and a fire that lit on the first match. She had a map in a clay pot and a mother's note that said yours, recorded both ways. She had Amos Keld's knowledge in her hands and her dead mother's observations in her chest, in 4 years of watching what the world did to people who weren't ready for it and filing the lessons away where they couldn't be taken. She was ready for it. In the second week of December, Amos came again. He came alone this time without the carrier and sat on the flat rock with his hands on his knees and the look of a man who has news he has been considering how to deliver. "Vera Pratt," he said. Nora said nothing. Cabins flooded on the north side. Wood store's been wet since the first snow. She had it under canvas, and the canvas failed in October. He looked at his hands. "She's burning fence posts now. She'll be through those by the end of the week." Nora looked at the fire ring, at the small, steady flame she had maintained for 7 weeks with the precision of someone who understood exactly what it cost per hour and what it was worth. "She knows something," Amos said, "about why she did what she did, about papers." That made Nora look up. Amos met her eyes steady and direct. "I'm not telling you what to do. I'm telling you what I know." He stood and settled his coat. "She's at the cabin, 2 or 3 days before she runs out of anything left to burn." He walked away through the trees without further elaboration. Nora sat with the fire for a long time. She fed it one small piece of bark and watched it take. She thought about Vera and about the cabin and about what knowing something meant when a person was sitting in the dark in December with no heat. She thought about what her mother would have done, and she thought about what her mother had actually done, which was planned further ahead than anyone around her expected, and she thought about the clay pot under the shelf with the map inside it. She went to Vera's cabin the next morning in the dark before dawn, when the cold was at its worst and the trail was empty of anyone else willing to move through it. The cabin door was unlocked. The inside was cold in the particular way of a space that had been warm and was no longer cold with the ghost weight of heat that was no longer there, the specific chill of a place that used to be safe and has stopped. Vera was in the chair by the dead stove wrapped in 2 blankets, her breathing audible from across the room. She was 54 years old, and she looked in that moment like someone who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had finally simply put it down. Not in relief, in exhaustion. She opened her eyes when Nora came in. She did not look surprised. She looked like someone who had known this moment was coming and had been waiting for it with a mixture of dread and relief that she no longer had the energy to separate. "Nora," she said. Nora stood in the middle of the room and waited. Vera looked at the dead stove, then at the ceiling, then at Nora, and there was something in her eyes that had not been there in 2 years of shared space, something that looked under the exhaustion and the cold and the bare fact of sitting alone in a dark cabin with nothing left to burn, like honesty. "Silas Cord came to me in September," she said, "before the first frost." She coughed once roughly. "He knew about the land filing. He knew about Miller Ridge. He told me he had a legal mechanism to claim the land if it was vacated, if there was no one in the county to contest it. He said if you were still here, he could tie it up in court for years under guardianship law, keep you in legal limbo until you were old enough to fight it properly, and by then he'd have had the land long enough to make the fight difficult." Nora was still. "He told me," Vera said, choosing the words carefully, "that if you were gone from the county, if there was no one here, he would leave my property alone. I have 40 acres on the South Road. Not much, but mine. He said if I didn't move you out, he'd challenge my deed too. Find something technical. He knows enough law to find something technical in anything." The cold sat in the room between them. "I didn't think you would," Vera started. "Don't," Nora said quietly. Vera stopped. "You should have told me," Nora said, the same tone she used for everything, not raised, not hot, just true. The way a level surface is true. Vera looked at her hands. There was no answer to it, and they both understood that. There was no version of the explanation that made it right, and Vera was too tired and too cold to attempt one. Nora looked around the cabin. She counted what was there and what wasn't: wood food, heat source prospects. Then she went to the door. "I'm leaving you enough wood to get through the week," she said. "I'll set it inside the door. Don't stack it outside." She pulled the door open. The cold came in immediately, thorough and impersonal. "When the week's done, you're on your own." She walked back to the draw in the early gray light, pulled 3 days' worth of wood from the outer stack, the pieces she had designated as surplus against her current calculations, and carried them to Vera's cabin in 2 trips without going inside again. Then she went home. It wasn't forgiveness. She didn't call it that. She called it what it was, the correct allocation of resources, given what she now knew. Vera had told her about cord. Cord was the problem. The problem had a shape now, and a shape could be worked with. She put another piece of wood on the fire. She thought about the map in the clay pot, about the stamp in the upper right corner, about the federal registry that existed independently of Silas Cord and everything he controlled and everyone who deferred to him. Eleanor Pratt, filed August 14th, 1885. Federal writer confirmed. She sat with the fire for a long time that night, tending it with the same precise attention she gave to everything, not more than was needed, not less than was required. Enough. Always exactly enough. Outside, the Montana winter continued its work without hurry and without mercy, breaking what hadn't been built to last and leaving alone for the moment what had. In the draw west of Harlan's Creek, beneath a clay roof that held, in a drainage channel that ran clean, an event that drew right, a fire burned at exactly the rate it needed to burn. 2 logs a night, measured, enough to last. And the girl who fed it had a dead man's map and a living woman's secret, and a judge who did not yet know that the variable in his arithmetic had been watching and thinking and building toward the moment when she would run the numbers herself. Spring came to Montana the way bad news comes to a person who has been expecting it, not as a surprise, but as a confirmation of something already understood in the bones. It did not arrive gently. It did not arrive with warmth and birdsong and the gradual softening of frozen ground into something forgiving. It arrived as melt, sudden, aggressive, indiscriminate, turning 4 months of accumulated snow into water that had nowhere in particular to go and no patience for finding out. The creek east of this draw ran over its banks on the first warm day of March and stayed there for 2 weeks. The main trail between Harlan's Creek and the Bridger Road became a gray soup of ice and mud that swallowed wagon wheels to the axle and released them at its own convenience. Cellars flooded. Root stores that had been preserved through the cold by staying frozen now had to contend with being wet, and most of them failed that test in ways that would take the summer to fully account for. Nora's Trench drained clean. The channel along the base of the north wall moved the water out before it could pool. The clay roof shed runoff to the east away from the entrance into the drainage ditch she had cut along the southern edge of the draw in November. The floor stayed dry, the remaining wood stayed dry, the clay pot sealed with pine resin and kept on the high shelf away from the wall stayed sealed. She stood outside on the first morning of real melt and watched the water move through the draw in a dozen small channels, each one finding the path she had given it, each one doing exactly what the slope and the angle and the careful placement of drainage channels told it to do. She watched it and felt something she didn't have an exact name for, not pride, because pride requires an audience, and she had built this alone in the dark and had not needed anyone to watch. It was more like confirmation, the settlement of an argument she'd been having with the world since October. The world had said, "You have nothing," and she had said, "Then I will build something." And the world had sent a winter at her that had killed horses and frozen wells and caved-in roofs, and the something she had built was still here, dry and intact and functional, on the first morning of March. She had made it through the winter of 1886 to 1887. Not many had. The accounting came in pieces over the following weeks, carried by Amos Keld on his irregular visits and by the evidence she could read on her trips into Harlan's Creek in the town's own damaged face. 3 families had lost members to the cold. Not to starvation, not to accident. To cold, to the specific and preventable failure of wet wood burned in inadequately ventilated spaces of heat that wasn't enough and arrived too late. The Harper family in November. 2 more in January, in the worst of the dry freeze when the temperature dropped so far below zero that the air itself seemed to harden. Several cabins had structural damage, roofs collapsed under accumulated load walls, buckled when the ground shifted and refroze in ways the foundations hadn't been built to accommodate. The schoolhouse had lost a corner. The church had lost its bell tower. One man had burned through his own floor joists in February, trying to dry his wood store from below, an act of desperation that said everything about how the winter had gone for the people who had not prepared. The town of Harlan's Creek looked in the March thaw like a place that had been in a serious fight and was only cautiously beginning to believe it had come out the other side. Nora walked its streets once a week now. Not to participate in its recovery, she had no particular investment, in how the town thought about itself, but because it was where supplies moved and information moved, and both of those things were still useful. She walked with the same quality of attention she brought to everything, straight, unhurried watching. People watched her back. She knew what they called her. The tunnel girl. She'd heard it first from a boy who'd come to the draw in January with his younger sister. Both of them half-frozen, asking for warmth in the specific voice of children who have been told that asking for things is shameful, but need has overruled that teaching. She'd let them in, fed them from what she could spare, sent them home before dawn, with strict instructions about what to tell their parents. The instructions hadn't held because instructions about silence never fully hold when children have been frightened and then warm and then sent home to parents who ask questions. The name spread anyway. Town wasn't large enough to contain anything for long, and she had been useful to enough people for those people to talk about her, even when they'd promised not to, because people talk, especially when they're afraid and then not afraid anymore, and need to make sense of the difference. She was 16 years old, and she had kept a fire burning through the worst winter in a decade without losing a single stick of dry wood while the rest of the county burned whatever it could find. That was worth talking about. She understood that. She didn't hold the talking against them. The letter arrived on a Thursday in late March. Amos came with it, a folded document with the county seal pressed into wax, handed over without comment. He sat on the flat rock while she opened it. She read it once quickly and once slowly. It was an official notice from the county land office signed by Judge Silas Cord. It cited Montana Territorial Statute 1885, Section 14, Paragraph 3, the provision governing unoccupied or unimproved parcels with uncontested county filing. It stated that the parcel known as Miller Ridge, filed under the name of Eleanor Pratt, deceased, had been identified as meeting the criteria for abandonment review, and that a petition for county acquisition had been filed by an unnamed interested party, effective 30 days from the date of the notice. 30 days. She folded the document and held it in both hands and looked at the draw, at the covered trench with its clay roof and its improved vent and its new door on a rawhide hinge, at the drainage channels running clean in the spring melt, at the rock face to the west, the same rock face she had stood in front of in October, with nothing on her feet and nothing in her hands but a tin cup. Then she reached under the sleeping shelf and took out the clay pot. She worked the resin plug loose with her thumbnail. She had practiced opening it quietly in the dark, enough times that her hands knew the exact pressure required. She tipped the pot and caught the contents, the folded paper from her mother's hem, soft now from handling, and beneath it the map. She unrolled the map on the flat rock beside Amos and held the edges with 4 river stones she'd carried for this purpose, smooth and flat, the kind the creek produced in quantity. She found Miller Ridge, found the grid reference, found the notation in the surveyor's careful handwriting. Eleanor Pratt, filed August 14, 1885. County reference MT-8821. Federal writer confirmed. And in the upper right corner, the stamp she had looked at 50 times and understood better with each reading. U.S. Land Survey, Office Montana Territory, Survey number 1142-MT, filed with Federal Registry. She looked at Amos. He was already looking at the map with the expression of a man doing arithmetic he has been waiting to do for some time. "That stamp," she said. "I see it. Federal Registry means..." "It means," Amos said slowly, "that the filing exists in 2 places. The county office, which Cord controls, and the federal land office in Helena, which he does not." He paused. "A county judge can challenge a county filing. He cannot override a federal survey registration without initiating a federal proceeding which requires federal review and federal approval, and cause that a territorial judge does not have the standing to manufacture." "He doesn't know about the federal filing," Nora said. "He told himself your mother couldn't afford a federal survey writer. He decided the answer before he checked." Amos looked at the map. "Men in his position often do about women in your mother's position." Nora rolled the map carefully, returned it to the clay pot, seated the resin plug. She picked up Cord's notice and looked at it one more time. 30 days. She thought about what her mother had done. Eleanor Pratt, who had never had more than $30 at one time, who had worked the land alone and raised a daughter without asking for anything from anyone, had spent her last $10 not on food or medicine or any of the ordinary necessities that money addresses, but on a county filing and a federal survey writer, and a piece of paper tucked into the hem of her daughter's dress. She had known she was dying. She had known Nora would be alone. And she had done the one thing she could think of to make sure that when the world came for her daughter, and she had understood that the world would come, her daughter would have something the world could not easily reach. Nora put the clay pot back under the shelf. "I need to go to Helena," she said. "No," Amos said. He stood, and the movement had the quality of a decision settling into place. "Helena has already done its part. You need to go to the county building." He looked at her steadily. "I was county clerk for this district from 1861 to 1873. I know every stamp and seal that office has used in the last 30 years, and I know the difference between county-level documentation and federal survey documentation because I handled both for 12 years. He paused. "I can confirm that registration as authentic, in writing under oath in front of the full council." Nora looked at him. "Why?" she said, not challenging, just a question asked plainly. He picked up his carrier and settled it on his shoulders. He was quiet for a moment in the way she had learned was not evasion, but precision, the time he took to say a thing correctly rather than just approximately. "Same reason I came back with those posts," he said. "The work was right. From the first day I looked at this draw, the work was right. The slope, the vent, the drainage, every decision correct made by someone who had thought about it before she had to." He looked at her. "I wasn't going to watch someone do the work right and let it get taken by a man who decided in advance it couldn't be done." "That's not the whole answer," she said. He looked at her for a moment, almost a smile though it didn't quite complete itself. "No," he said, "it isn't, but the rest will keep until after." He walked into the trees. Nora stood at the entrance to her trench for a long time. The spring air moved through the draw smelling of meltwater and pine, and the mineral sharpness of clay exposed to air after months under snow. A red-tailed hawk crossed the sky to the north unhurried, reading the thermals, with the casual expertise of something that has been doing this for a very long time. She went inside and built the fire up and sat with it until dark, and she didn't think about the next day. Tomorrow was close enough to take care of itself. The county building in Harlan's Creek had 2 rooms. The front room was the clerk's office and post station with its counter and its smell of paper and wax, and the particular staleness of a room that is used for official purposes and nothing else. The back room was where the council met and where Judge Silas Cord held his twice-monthly sessions, and where on a cold Tuesday morning in the first week of April, Nora Pratt walked through the door with Amos Keld at her side and a federal land survey map under her arm. Cord was already there. He had the look of a man who had been told to expect a minor inconvenience and had arranged himself to dispatch it efficiently. He sat at the head of the council table with his clerk Pruitt to his right and 2 council members, Hargrove the grain merchant and a newer man named Dalt, who had come up from Billings 2 years prior, to his left. He looked at Nora the way men like Cord look at things they have already classified briefly, with the incuriosity of someone whose conclusions precede his observations. Then his eyes moved to Amos, and something shifted in his face. "Mr. Keld," he said. "Judge," Amos said. Cord looked back at Nora. "Miss Pratt, you've received the notice regarding Miller Ridge." "I have," Nora said. "Then you understand that under territorial statute—" "I understand the statute," Nora said. Her voice was the same temperature it always was, not warm, not aggressive. Precise. "I also understand that it applies to county-level filings on unregistered parcels. Miller Ridge is not an unregistered parcel." She put the map on the table. She unrolled it and placed the 4 river stones from her coat pocket at the corners to hold it open. Then she stepped back and let the men at the table look at it. Nobody spoke for a moment. The map was what it was. Clean lines, careful measurements, the annotation in the surveyor's handwriting, and in the upper right corner, the stamp that did not belong to the county of Harlan's Creek or anything within Cord's jurisdiction. U.S. Land Survey, Office, Montana Territory. Survey number 114-2-MT, filed with Federal Registry. Cord's clerk leaned forward, looked at the stamp, looked at Cord, said nothing. "This could be fabricated," Cord said. The tone of a man testing a lock he believes is fastened, needing to check anyway. Amos stepped forward and placed a document beside the map. A single page, handwritten, dense and precise, signed at the bottom, and bearing a notary seal obtained from the Bridger office 2 days prior. "That is my sworn attestation. Amos said that Survey number 1142-MT Montana Territory bears an authentic stamp consistent with federal survey documentation issued by the Helena Land Office between 1883 and 1887. I served as county clerk for this district for 12 years. I have handled several hundred federal survey documents in that capacity, and I have handled the forgeries that come through a county office from time to time, and I know the difference between them. He looked at Cord. I am prepared to repeat this attestation in front of any federal representative the court wishes to summon. I would recommend against summoning one, as the inquiry that would follow would extend well beyond the question of this particular parcel. He looked at Cord steadily. You can argue with me, he said quietly. You cannot argue with Washington. The room was very still. Nora watched Cord's face. She watched the arithmetic happen, the slow, reluctant recalculation of a man discovering the cost of an assumption he had never thought to verify. He had assumed Eleanor Pratt couldn't afford a federal survey writer. He had assumed a 16-year-old girl with no shoes and no family would not survive the winter, let alone walk into his courtroom in April with federal documentation and a former county clerk prepared to swear to its authenticity under oath. He had assumed, and the assumption had been wrong, and the cost of being wrong was standing across the table from him, holding a map she had kept in a clay pot through 5 months of weather that had broken everything else. Councilmember Hargrove cleared his throat. He was a practical man, a grain merchant, and the opinion of the federal government had direct relevance to his business operations. Silas, he said in the careful tone of a man declining to be associated with a problem. If there's a federal registration on record, there is, Amos said. Hargrove looked at the map, then at Cord, then at the table. Then I don't see that we have a basis for the petition, he said. Cord was quiet for a long time. He looked at the map, at the stamp, at Amos's attestation, at the map again. When he spoke, his voice was controlled, the voice of a man who is lost and is choosing how to lose in a way that limits the subsequent damage. The petition is withdrawn pending further review, he said. He did not look at Nora when he said it. The filing stands, Pruitt wrote in his notebook. Nora picked up her river stones one by one and put them back in her coat pocket. She rolled the map, her hands knew the tension required, now the exact pressure to keep it from creasing, and tucked it under her arm. She looked at Cord once briefly, with the flat directness she gave to everything that needed to be acknowledged and then left behind. Then she walked out of the county building into the April air. Outside on the wooden walkway, she stood for a moment and let the sun touch her face. Not warm yet, not truly, but present in a way it hadn't been for 5 months, a real sun with intention behind it, beginning the long, patient work of undoing what the cold had done. Amos came out behind her. They stood together without speaking for a moment. Down the street, a man was repairing porch railing damaged in the winter. Across from him, 2 women were assessing a kitchen garden bed, deciding what had survived. Life returning to its ordinary operations the way it does when the emergency passes, not triumphantly, just steadily with the stubbornness of things that intend to continue. Your mother was a careful woman, Amos said. She was, Nora said. She planned the federal survey writer. She knew exactly what she was doing. She planned everything, Nora said, just not far enough ahead to be here for it. Amos said nothing for a moment. Then, she got far enough. Nora looked at the street, at the repaired porches and the thawing garden beds, and the chimneys putting out clean, pale smoke, drywood smoke, the smoke of things burning the way they should. Now, she said, tell me the rest of it, why you really helped. Amos looked at the street for a moment, at the man with the porch railing, at the women in the garden, at the town going about the business of recovering from something it hadn't been ready for. In the winter of 1839, he said, I was 10 years old. My father left me at a logging camp in Wyoming when a storm came in faster than anyone expected. He didn't come back. His voice was level, not performing the story, just delivering it. I dug myself into a snowbank because I'd seen a dog do it once, and it seemed better than standing in the open. A woman came through on the second day. I don't know her name. I never did. She had her own journey, and a stranger's child was not her obligation. He was quiet for a moment. She stopped anyway. Spent 3 days showing me the right way to do it. The slope, the vent, the clay, over the dirt, the drainage, everything. Then the weather broke and she walked on. He turned and looked at Nora directly. I built my version of it that winter, made mistakes. The roof came down on the second week. Two people I was sheltering were inside. He paused. I've been careful about my work ever since, about doing things right, about not leaving things unfinished because I was afraid of the pain. And me, Nora said, you were doing it right, everything right. The slope, the drainage, the vent, every decision correct before you had any reason to know if it was correct or not. He looked at her steadily. I wasn't going to watch someone do the work right and let it get taken. And I've been carrying a debt for 47 years that I needed to put down. He picked up his carrier. I'm glad it was you, he said. I'm glad it was this. He walked away down the street. Nora watched him go. She was standing in the middle of Harlan's Creek with a federal survey map under her arm and her mother's name on it and the April sun on her face, and she was aware with the particular clarity of someone who has been paying close attention through a very long and difficult thing that something had changed. Not in the world around her, the world was what it always was, indifferent and demanding, and full of men like Cord, who did their arithmetic, and women like Vera, who made bad choices out of fear, in winters that arrived without asking and took without apology. But in her, something had settled, the tightness she had carried behind her sternum since she was 13 years old, and understood for the first time that she was genuinely on her own. That tightness had not disappeared, but it had changed shape. It had become something more like a foundation than a wound, something you could build on rather than something you worked around. Vera was on the porch of her cabin when Nora came back through on the road home. She was sitting in the wooden chair she kept outside in good weather hands in her lap, doing nothing in particular, just sitting, the way people sit when they are tired in a way that sleep doesn't address. She looked better than she had in December, or at least better than she had looked sitting in the dark with a dead stove and 2 blankets and 3 days of fence posts left. But she had the quality of someone who had been carrying something for a long time and had recently set it down and was still getting used to the absence of the weight. She watched Nora come up the road without moving. Nora stopped at the edge of the property, not on the porch, on the road where the line between visiting and passing through remained clear. Cord withdrew the petition, she said. Vera nodded slowly. The land is mine, Nora said. It was always mine. Mama made sure of it before she died. Vera looked at her hands, at the porch boards, then at Nora, and there was something in her face suspended between what she knew and what she could say about it, something unresolved. Waiting. I know, she said. I know that now. Nora looked at her for a moment, at her mother's cheekbones and her aunt's face. The same bone structure, the same inherited architecture, a different life built over it. She thought about what Amos had said about carrying a debt for 47 years, about finding the right moment to put it down, about what putting something down meant and what it didn't mean, and the difference between the two. You should have told me, she said. The same words she had said in December in the coal cabin with the dead stove. But they landed differently now in the April air, with the petition withdrawn and the land filed and the winter finished and the fire still burning. Not an accusation, just a statement of fact offered for the last time. Vera nodded. I know that too, she said. Nora walked on. She did not look back, not from anger. The anger had burned down to something she could use rather than something that used her. She walked on because there was work to do and the work was waiting, and she had never been the kind of person who stood still when there was something to be built. The summer came properly by late May. The draw transformed in a way she hadn't anticipated. She had only known it in gray and white, and the brown of frozen earth, and now it went green with an insistence that surprised her, the grass coming up through the clay, deposits, and the rock face showing amber and orange in the afternoon light, in the creek to the east running clear and fast over its stones. She stood at the entrance of the trench on the first genuinely warm morning and looked at what the land was doing with the season and felt the particular satisfaction of a place that had been well chosen, making good on its promise. She kept the trench. She improved it. In June, with Cobb Keld's help, over 2 long afternoons, she extended the south branch another 12 feet and added a second tier of shelving wider and better braced than the first, using lumber Cobb had salvaged from the collapsed mill barn outside town. She rebuilt the vent system with a longer horizontal run and a more concealed exit point camouflaged well enough that you would have to be looking specifically for it to find it. She repacked the entire clay roof, stripped the winter layer, which had compressed and cracked in the thaw cycle, and laid fresh material in 3 coats, each tamped flat and allowed to set before the next went on. She lined the walls of the sleeping alcove with flat creek stones, smooth and dense, the kind that held heat when warmed and released it slowly through the night. She made a proper door from 2 salvaged planks on a rawhide hinge, fitted tight enough to hold the wind and loose enough to open cleanly in the dark without searching for the catch. Cobb came back the following week, and the week after that without being asked. He looked at the grade she'd marked for the West Passage extension, walked it twice, then picked up a spade and started working. He never announced when he was arriving and never explained when he was leaving. He worked the way he did everything with the quiet competence of someone who had learned that showing up and doing the thing was the whole of the obligation and that everything else was performance. They expanded the West Passage over 3 sessions. It went deeper than the main trench cooler, away from any spring melt risk, a storage section for things that needed cold rather than warmth for the summer when the problem reversed. When they finished the 3rd session, Cobb looked at it for a moment with the expression his father used, the evaluating look of a craftsman checking whether the work was right. He nodded once. Then he picked up his tools and left before dark the way he always did, without announcement, without ceremony, the way good work ends when it's done. People came to her now, not desperately the way they had come in winter, with fear in their voices and no options behind them, purposefully with something in hand and something in mind. A farmer from the East Road wanted to know about underground grain storage. His stores had been half rotten by February, 2 months of feed lost. A woman with 3 children wanted to understand keeping root vegetables through hard cold without losing them to freeze or to moisture. 2 brothers building a new cabin wanted advice on drainage and foundation work in clay-heavy soil. Nora answered what she answered and kept what she kept. "Slope your floor," she told the farmer. 3 degrees toward the door, not less. Water finds the low point. If the low point is outside, the water goes outside. If it's inside, it stays with everything you stored. He nodded, the kind of man who wrote things in muscle memory rather than on paper. Angle your vent upward, not straight up and away from the entrance, so the draw pulls from inside out rather than pushing from outside in. Cover your roof with clay, not just dirt. Dirt compresses and cracks when it freezes and thaws. Clay moves, but it seals the crack when it moves. 2 coats minimum tamped wet before each layer sets. And the walls? Rock if you have it. Creek rock is better than quarried because it's already been shaped by water. If not rock, then clay and lifts wet, compacted, dried, then another lift over it. Don't rush the drying between lifts. A wall that hasn't set is just mud waiting to fall. He looked at her with the expression she had seen on Amos Keld's face the first day he stood at the edge of the draw, the particular acknowledgement that comes when a person finds knowledge they didn't expect in a place they didn't expect to find it. "What do I owe you?" he said. "What can you spare?" she said. He thought for a moment. "I could pay you in coin." "I don't take coin," she said. He looked at her. "Coin rusts," she said. "Sugar keeps." He left a half bushel of dried corn and a coil of good rope and 2 pounds of sugar in a sealed tin. She put the corn on the shelf and the rope on the hook behind the door and the sugar in the back of the storage section alongside the other things that would last, and she went back to work. They started calling her the Clay Builder. Sometimes the Tunnel Girl, that one had been going since January. She didn't particularly like either name, but she understood that names were what people did when they needed to talk about something they didn't fully understand, and she didn't hold it against them. A few men from the far side of town tried to copy the trench that spring. She heard about it from Amos, not asking her permission, not asking her advice, just attempting it from what they had seen or heard described. She didn't interfere. She let them try. 2 of the 3 got the drainage wrong and would find out in the next heavy rain why the slope mattered. The 3rd got the slope right but covered the roof with plain dirt instead of clay and would find out in the first hard freeze why that mattered. They would come to her afterward. They would bring on something worth trading. She would explain exactly what they'd done wrong and how to correct it, and they would go away with the right information, and the next version would be better. That was how knowledge moved. Not from books, not from lectures, but from failure examined carefully and corrected, passed from one person to the next in the language of practical detail. Her mother had understood that. In the last week of June, on a warm evening, when the light came in low and gold across the draw and turned the rock face the color of old copper, Amos came by with a bundle under one arm. He set it on the flat rock at the edge of the draw without any introduction and stood looking at the improved trench with the expression of a craftsman conducting a serious inspection. He walked the perimeter, slowly checking the drainage at the corners, the grade of the approach, the set of the new door, the rebuilt vent exit, and its camouflage. He looked at the clay roof, smooth and flat, and already beginning to take its summer cover of grass. He nodded once, then he untied the bundle. A pickaxe. New handle white oak. Straight grain, finished smooth with linseed oil, the grain running true from shoulder to end, without twist or knot. New head steel, properly weighted for the work it was made for the edge ground, clean and sharp. The balance of it was immediately evident, even from a distance, the kind of tool made by someone who understood what it was for and had built it according to that understanding, rather than according to some general idea of what a pickaxe should weigh. He set it against the flat rock. He didn't explain it. He didn't frame it or contextualize it. He set it down with the quiet deliberateness of a man completing a transaction that has been pending for a long time, and then he stepped back. "Cobb knows how to find this place," he said, "if you need anything." He walked away through the long evening light, unhurried in the direction of town. Nora stood at the entrance to her trench and looked at the pickaxe for a moment. Then she crossed to it and picked it up. The balance was right. She could tell immediately the way. You can tell a tool is right before you have used it in the way it sits in your hand without demanding adjustment. The handle was the correct length for her height, which meant someone had paid attention to who would be using it, had thought about it practically, and built accordingly. The edge was sharp and clean. She held it at her side, testing the weight and the grip. Then she looked out across the draw. Across the green summer grass and the glinting creek and the rock face catching the evening light, and beyond it the open land stretching west under a sky that was for the first time in many months, simply and completely clear. No iron, no threat, just sky deep blue at the horizon going darker overhead. Miller Ridge. Her mother had bought it with the last money she had paid to have it measured and recorded by a federal surveyor and filed in an office in Helena where the signature of a small-town judge carried no weight whatsoever. Had tucked the receipt into the hem of her daughter's dress and died without knowing whether any of it would be enough. It had been enough. The land was hers. The trench was hers. The fire that had burned through the worst winter in a decade that had kept her alive when Silas Cord's arithmetic had placed her in the category of variables that resolved themselves without requiring intervention, that fire was hers. Every buried log that had lit into flame was a promise that had held. Every piece of dry wood in a county full of wet wood was proof that the things her mother had paid attention to were worth paying attention to. She was 17 years old. She'd had no shoes when she started $10. She hadn't spent a federal map retrieved from a dead man's satchel in the snow, and the accumulated observations of a quiet woman who had spent her life watching the things that mattered, while the world around her watched other things. She thought about what Amos had said on the wooden walkway outside the county building, squinting into the April sun. She got far enough. Nora looked at the trench one more time, at the door she had built, and the roof she had packed, and the drainage that ran clean, and the vent that drew right, and the walls that had held through 5 months of weather that had broken better constructed things than anything she had made with her own hands, and a cracked pickaxe handle, and 40 cents in a dead woman's knowledge. It was not finished. She had already marked the clay for the next extension, deeper into the slope on the north side, braced differently to account for the angle, with a second vent running on an independent line from the first, so that if one was blocked, the other kept drawing. She had been working out the vent placement for 2 weeks, calculating the angle by eye in the evenings, when the light was right, the way her mother had taught her to use the horizon as a reference. There was always more to build. She put the pickaxe on her shoulder and walked down into the draw, into the last of the evening light, onto the ground her mother had bought with $10, and a belief that her daughter was worth planning for. The draw was soft under her feet now, summer ground warm at the surface and cool an inch down, the way good clay-heavy soil behaves when it has been well drained and properly maintained. She could feel the difference between the clay deposits and the rocky soil at the margins, the slight give in the packed areas, and the firmness at the edges. The way she had learned to feel the slope under her heel and read the density of earth under her palm through months of working it. She knew this ground. She had moved it and shaped it and built into it, and it had held everything she gave it to hold. The ground remembered the shape you gave it. The shape you gave it was the shape of what you believed was possible. She set the edge of the pickaxe against the marked clay on the north slope. The pickaxe found the earth. The earth gave way. And in the long summer light on the land her mother had bought with the last money she had, in a belief that some things were worth planning for, even when you wouldn't be there to see the plan succeed, the girl who had been thrown out with nothing continued the work of building something no storm could reach. The ground remembered. She was making sure it would not forget.